also sort of the techniques I use to track birds.
Emily, can you stand over here? We have to let the camera find you.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Move around. Be a big bird. There you go.
Okay. Okay, I can like turn around and what I do. But anyway, yes, I'm going to talk about some of my research first, and then we're going to talk both about Wirebird, which is this new initiative at the university trying to increase bird research and outreach, and talk a little bit about that. And then Katie's going to talk about her work with window collision stuff. So anyway, my research, I'm looking at a lot of different things across the full annual cycle in sagebrush songbirds, and so I'm going to talk about different ways that I track them across the annual cycle. And before I start, this is one of my birds. This is a brewer sparrow, and you can see, yeah, he's got a lot of jewelry on. So this is one of the earliest ways that we can actually track individuals across years. So all of my birds each have individual color band combinations, so that I can actually go out and recite them and recognize individuals across years and throughout years. And I'm going to talk about that later. It's important for what I do. But anyway, I wanted to start by talking about why I'm doing what I'm doing and why it's important. So historically, ecology has focused on monitoring changes in populations and trying to understand what causes those changes. But if we're only looking at populations at one snapshot in time, so for example, this is something you guys would recognize, a Christmas bird count in 1900, we can see that populations are changing across years, but it's hard to understand what's actually causing those changes. So if you do a Christmas bird count every year, of course you're going to see some changes in populations, some might be going down, but it's hard to pinpoint what's actually happening. But historically, it's been really difficult to study the full annual cycle in a lot of small nomadic and migratory animals because of the limits in the size of technology. So for example, for birds, a lot of research is focused on the nesting period, because obviously that's a much easier period to study these animals. They're in one place at one given time. But recent advances in technology do allow us now to track a lot of these small animals when they're moving or at different points in their life cycle, when they're moving and they're migratory and that kind of thing. And so why should we worry about studying the annual cycle? Well, like I said, it's hard to understand what's happening if we're only looking at populations in one snapshot in time. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of why it's been really important to study the full annual cycle. So in this first example, this is golden-winged warblers that were studied in a few different breeding populations. One breeding population was in Wisconsin, which you can see in figure A, and the other breeding population was in Tennessee. And the population that was breeding in Wisconsin was doing really well, but the population that was breeding in Tennessee was declining. But researchers couldn't understand why that was happening because both of those habitats were intact, nothing was changing on their breeding grounds. We didn't really understand why is this one population doing so badly and the other one isn't. It wasn't until they decided to actually track these birds to their overwintering areas that they could see more of the picture. So what they did is they used light level geolocators, which I'm going to talk about later, and they tracked individuals down to their wintering areas. So on these maps, each of these lines is one individual and their migration down to their wintering areas. And what they found was that for this population in figure A, they were going down to Central America, and you can see that the individuals are really spreading out, so they were going to a bunch of different areas in Central America. But then for the population in figure B, they were all going to the same clustered area in northern South America. And of course, this area was experiencing a lot of habitat loss as well, which they didn't realize before. So there's two different things that are happening here. One is that there's differences in migratory connectivity. And so what that means is a population with high migratory connectivity means that this population, they spend their breeding period all together, and then they all travel together and also spend another period, like the overwintering period, in the same place together. But a population that has low migratory connectivity means that individuals will spread out. So after breeding, they're all going to go to different places, which is safer for that population, because you can imagine if there's some habitat loss, not all individuals are going to the same area, so the population is going to do better. So that's one thing that's happening. And then, of course, the other thing that's happening is that there's a lot of habitat loss in this one specific overwintering area. And so because researchers decided to study these birds outside of their breeding period, they were able to figure out, okay, to conserve these populations, we need to focus on protecting their overwintering areas instead. And then the other thing that we want to think about when thinking about the full annual cycle is not just what's happening in one single period, but also how those stressors might be influencing what's going on in later periods of their lives. So I'm going to talk about this with gray whales. So gray whales will spend their summers up in the Arctic, and they spend the summer foraging and eating plankton and things like that. And then they travel down to the coast of California, which is where the mothers will give birth to their calves, and then they'll raise their calves in the winter. Now, in really warm summers in the Arctic, there's not a lot of ice up there, and so they're able to forage and eat a lot of food, and they're usually very successful in the wintering period when they go to calve. But in summers when it's really cold and there's a lot of ice, they're not able to forage very well, and then their calving success is much lower. And so it's important that we're tracking them because even though they're doing fine and they're surviving their summer period, their fitness is affected in the following period, so they're not able to reproduce as well and that kind of thing. And so that's something that's called carryover effects, and that's another thing that I'm looking at, and something that it's important to think about when we're looking at the full annual cycle. So anyway, I'm going to talk about my study system. I work in Wyoming, so you guys are going to recognize these birds. But I study 3 species of sagebrush obligate songbirds, and so if you don't know, that means that they rely on sagebrush habitats in order to breed. And so these 3 species are the brewer sparrow, the sagebrush sparrow, and the sage thrasher. And I was going to share the song with you guys a little bit, so you guys, some of you might recognize the song already or know what they sound like, but this is what a brewer sparrow sounds like. Let's see if it plays. So we've got this like buzzy trill song. What's cool about them is that they actually have 2 different songs. So this is their short song, and then once they are paired or they have a mate, then they switch to a different song called their long song, which is a much longer trill. So you guys might recognize that. Sorry. I'm not sure how to make it stop. Okay, that's the long song. I guess I'm just listening to the sounds of the sagebrush. Yeah. This will be different songs. But anyway, so sagebrush sparrows, they have this shorter song that I might just not go for it because it's going to be too much. But yes, I'm sure we can recognize them. Anyway, so the other important thing about these species is that they're all considered species of greatest conservation need in Wyoming. And that's because their populations are declining both in Wyoming but across their ranges as well. And so one of the reasons for this decline is that their habitat, their breeding habitat, is in peril. So unfortunately, the sagebrush steppe is actually one of the most imperiled ecosystems in North America, and we've lost about 50% of sagebrush steppe habitat due to human development. And so this is a map of Wyoming. This is actually kind of outdated. It's from 2003, so this does need to be updated, and there's quite a lot more development now than what's shown up here. But this map is showing sagebrush habitat in green, and then oil and natural gas development in these warm colors. So you can see how much overlap there is between development and the sagebrush habitat, which is really affecting these birds. And so my study area is in Pinedale, Wyoming, and so again, just like everywhere else, there's been a lot more development since this map was made, so you can imagine a lot more yellow in this area. But this is where I research these birds, and they're experiencing a lot of development there. And what we know about these birds is that development does impact them during the breeding period. So in areas of high development, there's a change in the species composition. So things like rodents do really well in developed areas, and they do well with human structures and that kind of thing. And so when there are more rodents, there's actually more nest predation, and then nests are more likely to fail in these areas. And that's what this graph is showing. So on the x-axis, it's just showing habitat loss due to natural gas development. And on the y-axis is the likelihood of a nest surviving each day. So you can see that as you go to areas of higher development, the nest survival decreases. And that's for sage thrashers, but this is true for all of the species.
They're nesting on the ground?
They nest in shrubs. So the rodents are able to climb up in them. And it's just sagebrush that's like this tall. So it's pretty unsafe for these birds. So I was going to share a video. So one thing my lab has done is looked at a lot of nest predation, and so we have these video cameras to look at what's happening in nests, and we're able to catch predation events. Just so you know, this does show predation, so if you don't want to see it, you can look away. But we have a lot of different nest predators out of the sites, not just rodents. So this is like a badger. This is loggerhead shrike, so there's a lot of avian predators out there.
Oh.
Hmm.
What is that?
That one's a loggerhead shrike. Yeah. Got a lot of chipmunks.
It's like a grocery store.
Yeah, a lot of these nest fails. It's a little rough to watch. Oh, this is a deer mouse. And so deer mice are actually the most common nest predator in the system, which might be unexpected, but that's actually the biggest one that we see. Ground squirrels as well. And then there are a lot of raptors, so this is going to be a harrier coming in. I see.
Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, a lot of predation in the system, and we know that development does affect predation. So like a lot of other songbird species, we know a lot about the nesting period. So what I'm going to be talking about today is my research, which is going into other periods of the annual cycle. So one of those periods is the post-fledging period, which is after the young leave the nest, and I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm also going to talk about migration and overwintering periods and trying to understand where these birds actually go, because we don't actually know that for these birds. So I'll talk about first I'll be talking about the post-fledging period and using specifically radio telemetry to track birds during this period. So like I said, the post-fledging period is the time after youngs leave the nest, but at this time they're still dependent on their parents. And in my system, they actually aren't able to fly when they first leave the nest. So they are very fragile at this time. They're not very mobile, and they're gradually learning to forage and become more independent. And in a lot of songbird species, we also know that this is a period of really high mortality, but it hasn't been studied in migratory species yet, so we don't really know what's happening during this period. And so one of the things that I do is I go out and I will measure nestlings while they're still in the nest. I'll put color bands on them, just like adults, so I can track them. So this is a nestling sage thrasher that I was measuring. And then I measure things like wing, leg length, and that kind of thing, body conditions, so that I can look at those later. And then I come back on the day that they're supposed to fledge, and I'll put a radio tag on them. So this is a sage thrasher fledgling with the tag, so you can see the antenna coming off of it. And what that tag does is it beeps every 30 seconds with a signal, and then after they leave the nest, we can go out with our own antenna and follow the strength of the signal until we find the bird. And so once we find the bird, this is the birds that are hanging out, then we'll mark where they are so we can look at like the habitat they're using and that kind of thing. And it's really important to use radio telemetry because it's very, very difficult to find these birds. So see if you guys can find this rooster in this photo. Yeah, without radio telemetry, we would not be able to find them at all. And there's a reason they're so cryptic at this period. It's because they're not able to get away from predators. So this is their way of avoiding predators like us, trying to find them. And a lot of times we do find mortalities, and so we're trying to understand both the causes of those mortalities and also how many of these birds actually die after they leave the nest. And so a lot of times we're able to identify the cause. So for example, this photo on the left is a mortality from predation. So you can see like the wing of the bird is at the top and the legs in the bottom. We'll also sometimes find birds in ground squirrel holes and things like that, so we're able to identify that. But then there's other times where we'll find a completely intact bird and we know it wasn't a predation because it's still there. And a lot of those happen after major weather events or hailstorms or things like that, so we're able to identify those causes. And so one of the things I'm looking at is just how that mortality might vary across species and years. So we don't have to go too deep into this, but basically this is showing, I have two bars here on the left that are showing brewer sparrows that were tracked in 2 different years. And then the 2 bars on the right are showing sagebrush sparrows and sage thrashers. And green is showing percent of survival, the blue is showing mortalities, and I have a split by mortality type. But basically what's important here is that we know that survival varies quite a lot across both species and also years. So there are a lot of different factors that might be affecting that, which we want to look more into, and that's some of my research. And so, like I said, there are different mechanisms that might be influencing mortality. One might be weather events at the top, and one might be predation. So one of my hypotheses is that condition of these birds when they're developing the nest is going to affect their survival from those factors. And so birds in better body condition might be better able to survive weather events, and those with more developed wings or legs might be more mobile and able to survive from predation. So that's another thing that I look at with this data. So this is, for example, brewer sparrows. And what I found was that birds with longer wings when they were nestlings were less likely to die in the post-fledging period. So wing development was really important to their survival. But I also found that body condition did not have an effect. So that was kind of interesting, and I'm still continuing to look into this. It's still preliminary, but anyway, yeah. So it shows that it is important for them to be mobile and be able to avoid predators during this period.
How long is the post-fledgling period?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're still trying to figure that out with these birds, but they're usually dependent on their parents for like 2 to 3 weeks after they leave the nest, and then they actually remain in the same area afterwards, but they will group up with other juveniles and then travel around, and then they don't actually leave or start migrating until sometimes like September or October, so they'll stay in the same area, but it's no longer considered the post-fledgling period because they're independent at that point, basically. Yeah, but that's a great question, and it's important to that's something I have to figure out because I need to know like how long is this period that we're gonna consider for mortality when we're making trying to figure out like what's happening to the population and that kind of thing. So.
Did they stay in the same general location until they migrate?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once they become more mobile, they will travel a lot further, like within a kilometer, but they still stay. They'll like travel off and then come back to the same plot and kind of travel around that way. Yeah.
Are they territorial?
Adults are territorial, but the juveniles are not. So adults have territories for their nesting period, but the juveniles, like once they leave, they travel in groups and they're not worried about territories or any of that. So, yeah. Cool. So next I'm going to talk about another part of my project is tracking these birds both on their breeding grounds but also off their breeding grounds using that radio telemetry but using this different network. So in addition to that handheld telemetry that I talked about, we can do the same thing with permanent towers. So basically instead of carrying around an antenna, you can build a tower and put an antenna on it, and then anytime a bird passes by that tower, you can get a ping for that bird. And what's really cool about that system is that it's not only your tower or your birds, but you can connect to a broader network called the MODIS network. And so this is a pretty new thing. It's this network of radio telemetry towers that are international. Most of them are in the US, but you can see that they're shown in blue and they're all over the world. And any of my birds that will pass by another tower anywhere else in the US while they're migrating, I'll see that they pinged that tower. And also, I have towers in Pinedale, and I've gotten birds from British Columbia, for example, that have flown by my towers too. So it's a really cool system and a way to track birds when we can't use GPS. So this is just showing, I have 6 towers in Pinedale. These are the locations of those towers on the study area. And this is what they look like. I'm not an electrician or anything, so it's a real challenge for me to build these things. But anyway, they basically stay out there all year long, and they're ready to pick up birds that fly by. And so I'll put radio tags not just on fledglings, but also on adults. So this is an adult sage thrasher, and it's wearing this radio tag, which has a small solar panel on it, a little black thing. And so this tag is actually supposed to last the bird's whole life because it doesn't have a battery. So it's going to keep pinging for that bird's whole life. And every time the bird comes back to my study area, I'll be able to see that it came back, which has been really useful.
Is it a unique signal for
Yeah.
each one of these?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, each bird has a unique signal, so I can identify individuals. Yeah. Yeah.
So how are they attached?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, I didn't talk about that. So it's called a leg loop harness, but basically it's the stretchy material, and you like put it up on their legs, and then it sits up on their back. Yeah. So it doesn't interfere with their leg movement or anything because it's kind of up at the junction of their legs and their body.
How do you capture them?
It's really tricky. Yeah, so most of the time I will find their nests first, and then I'll target them at the nest. So I set up a mist net, and then I'll do things like either chase them off the nest into the net, or a lot of times, especially for males, I can use playback because they're territorial. So I'll put down a speaker or 2 speakers, and I'll play song, and the males will get really angry because they think there's another bird in their territory, and they'll fly at the song and fly into the net and that kind of thing. So, yeah. But it's very hard. It can sometimes take a while to catch a bird if they're really smart, so, yeah. And the other thing I can do with this network is also track the birds on their breeding grounds. And so attached to those towers, I also have this grid of smaller antennas. And basically it works like a reverse GPS system where when a bird is traveling around, I can triangulate its position based on the strength of this signal to multiple antennas, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like how GPS works, except instead of going to satellites, it's on the ground. And then I can get maps of bird movement. So this is a brewer sparrow. This is actually a fledgling brewer sparrow. And what's really cool about this map, it doesn't seem that exciting, but is that this bird was being tracked passively. So we weren't going out and following it and affecting its movements. I was just tracking it with the system. And the reason that's so exciting is that these birds are very small, they're like 10 grams. So they cannot wear a GPS collar like a mule deer can. So while all my other friends are working on mule deer and tracking them with GPS, I'm trying to use these other systems to track them, which is really cool. And it's awesome that we can start to actually do this with these tiny birds.
How many birds do you have tagged?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to talk about another type of tag I use, but for radio tags, I have I've tagged about 300 birds at this point. That's both fledglings and adults. I think adults is more like 100, and then fledglings about 200. Yeah.
What's their lifespan?
Yeah, so they have really high mortality when they're young and in their first year. But if they make it past that period, probably about 7 or 8 years. So I started banding birds in 2020, and I have as adults, and so they were at least a year old at that point. And I have recited some of them like this past year. So we don't actually know for these species exactly how long their lifespan is, but that's about what it is for a lot of other sparrows, and so that's what I'm guessing. But I'll be able to see that a little bit. Yeah.
So has putting these devices on the birds in any way affected their mortality?
That's a great question. Yeah. So one thing with putting these tags on these birds is there's a limit to how large it can be, obviously, and it has to be less than 3% of the bird's body weight, which is what the bird banding lab has decided is safe. So it's really small. That's about like the weight of like a watch would be or something, or maybe a little more than that for a human, but it's still very small. And I did an analysis to look at return rates for these birds, and there was no difference in tagged versus untagged birds. So it seems that it doesn't affect their mortality at all. I think the reason for that is because we're so limited in the size of the tags that we put on them. Yeah.
When you're banding and tagging babies in the nest, how do you keep from having the adults abandon that nest after you get yours?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, so the adults are very loyal in the system, basically. So it's never been a concern. We do have to be careful when there's still eggs that we don't spend a lot of time at the nest because they will abandon if it's still on eggs. But once the eggs hatch, then at that point they're not going to abandon it. They're kind of like all in at that point. So yeah, the adults will actually do things like a broken wing display if you've ever seen that. So they pretend like their wing is broken to try to distract me. So they will they'll put themselves in danger, assuming that I was a predator, they'll fly right by me, and yeah, they're very loyal to their young, so.
How many eggs do they usually lay?
Yeah, it depends on the species. So for the brewer sparrows and sagebrush sparrows, it's 3 to 4 eggs per clutch, and then for sage thrashers, it can be up to 6 eggs, but it's usually somewhere between 3 and 6. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So I'll talk about the last technology I'm using. So I'm also trying to document the migratory routes of these birds because they've never been tracked outside of the breeding period at all, so we actually don't know where they migrate. And so to do this, I use a different device that I mentioned before called a light level geolocator. So this is a brewer sparrow wearing one on its back, so the same harness I was talking about for the other tags. And it has this little light stalk coming off of it. And I have this fun video of a brewer sparrow being released. Let's see if it plays. And like I mentioned before, all of my birds are also color banded, and this is going to be important for these tags because these tags are much too small to send information. All they're doing is collecting information, so they're called archival tags. And that means that I have to recapture the bird and get the tag back in order to get the data off of it. Like I said before, these birds are 10 to 12 grams, so this is a super tiny tag that we put on them. The tag itself is, I think, is 0.3 grams. So anyway, we let the bird fly off. It goes down, it spends its winter down south, it comes back, and then the next breeding season, we go out and look for the birds. Once we recite them using the color bands, then I go out and then target them again. I'll take the tag off and then release them and let them go about their lives. And this is what the information looks like that I actually get off the tag. So the only thing that this tag collects is information about light. That's the only thing. And so this graph is showing what I get. So the x-axis is the time of the year, or the date. In the middle, that's actually showing nighttime. So at the top, when it's going from light to dark, that's sunset. And then when it's going from dark to light again, that's sunrise. And so I'm able to use information about the timing of sunset and sunrise to figure out where the bird was at a given time. Because as you guys know, the timing of sunset and sunrises changes both with time of year, but also with where you are in the world at a given time. And this does give me some error. So the error is about 200 kilometers latitude, 50 kilometers longitude. And so this is usually easier to say in Laramie, but it's about the size of Albany County, you know, you guys know. So anyway, so I take that information and I turn it into these locations. So this is a sage thrasher that I tracked, and so he was banded up where that triangle is, that's Pinedale, and then the orange is his fall migration, the yellow is his overwinter movements, and then the blue is the movements in the spring. And so we're able to kind of start to get at where these birds are going.
Emily, so you have a computer program that takes the information and translates it into a location within a margin of error.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just put in a computer program. Yeah, I use R, if you guys know that, and people have written up code. It's complicated and difficult, like learning curve, but they've written up code to figure out where those timings of sunset and sunrises correspond to places. Yeah. And you also, like, it helps because you know the general area that this bird is going to be, so you can knock out a lot of parts of the world and that kind of thing. It helps you kind of narrow it down. So, yeah.
I want to know, why did you choose Pinedale?
So I'm working, well, a lot of my questions, I'm not talking about it here, but are about how natural gas development affects survival in these other periods. And so out there, we have this gradient of plots across different developed areas. And my lab has been doing research out there since 2008 on this development gradient, so I'm kind of able to build on that research. Yeah. So one other thing I want to say about this, so I know like these errors, this location does have some error. What's nice is that I can combine these different methods of tracking. So on the right, this is another sage thrasher that had a radio tag, and these dots are actually those motor stations I was talking about. And so that bird had pinged the station down near San Antonio. And so basically, I'm able to start using these different techniques to kind of get out where these birds are going and kind of use all these different techniques because we can't use an easy GPS system. So, yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to finish up by talking about why this is important. And so as you guys all know, we used to hear about birds. Birds are really declining in a lot of places. And we've lost nearly 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. And we still don't really understand what's causing a lot of these population declines. And so my research and the reason all this tracking is important is going back to the beginning. It's important for us to understand what's happening during different points of the annual cycle and to use tracking technology to understand that, so that we're not just seeing population changes, but we can understand when those changes might be occurring in the cycle. This is just acknowledging the funders. I think the main ones are Wyoming Game and Fish have provided a lot of funding, the BLM and Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative. We've also gotten Audubon Society money and all that, so appreciate all of that. And I think, so we have enough time, maybe I'll skip to any other questions at the end. We can talk a little bit about Whitebird, if that seems good.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys have heard about Whitebird yet. This is a new initiative that just started at the University of Wyoming, but I'm going to be reading a bit because I don't want to miss anything. Anyway, so it's housed in the Department of Zoology and Physiology. It's open to all students that are interested in studying with birds, and it's all about trying to bring more people into bird research and also conduct more outreach about birds at University of Wyoming and in Wyoming in general. Is there anything more you want to say about what it is in general? Or?
No, I think you pretty much covered that.
Okay.
Emily, are you a doctoral student? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How,
Yeah.
how far along are you?
I am in year 4. Yeah. So.
So you're doing research and starting to work on your dissertation, or?
Yeah, yeah, so what I just talked about is all part of my dissertation. I didn't go in depth about the questions I'm asking, but I'm, going along with it, I guess.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to tell who you are when you're in the middle of a PhD, but yeah. Yeah.
And this is all through zoology and physiology department?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't mention this, but I'm in zoology and physiology. I'm also in the Wyoming co-op unit, if you guys know that, yeah. So that's like doing research in Wyoming. And then also I'm part of the program in ecology, which is a broader program at the university for PhD students, basically, kind of combining different ecology-related fields. So, yeah.
Did you do your undergraduate in Wyoming, or did you?
No, I went to Cornell for undergrad. That's why I got into birds.
Yeah.
So I guess for Wild-Bird and
The two projects we've gone down with are, so far, we've had the swallow nest box study, which goes into Nest Watch. There's a really cool, it's a nationwide database, and you can see this photo here, of us opening up the boxes, and we look at the life stage that the young are at, what the adults are doing, and then also like the stage of the nest. So we got all the information, and that goes into a national database. This was really fun. It was very hands-on. This was out at Hutton Lake, where you guys, I think, said you guys were going to do a field trip at. So all those boxes on the fences are what we were checking from about mid-May to about end of August. And we wrapped that up, and they were all fledged and wonderful.
Yeah, and then the other big project that Wild-Bird's just started is a banding station, a fall migration banding station in Laramie. So it just finished up, I think, on Saturday. This is the first year, but hopefully it's going to become a recurring thing. And this will be a way to both engage more undergrads who want to gain research experience and other people who want to gain research experience. And then hopefully look at some long-term questions about population changes by banding the same time every year during the fall migration. So it was really successful this year. I was just out there, like, our last few days, migration was kind of ending, so like you guys were saying, we had a lot of, like, chickadees, and we did have some yellow-rumped warblers, both audubons and myrtles and that kind of thing. So, yeah, some of the same things you were seeing. Yeah.
What kind of information does the band contain?
Yeah, so the only thing the band has is a unique number on it. But what that allows you to do is to get recaptures. And so once a bird is marked, then you can, if you recapture the individual, that helps you look at like survival rates, because you can take into account the likelihood of recapture or capture probability and that kind of thing. And so when you have that taken into account, you can actually start to get at like survival rates in adults and that kind of thing.
So you work with the people where the bird migrates south. Are you working with people down there? Do they have the same information in that bird that you have? That you
Yeah, so if
share with?
Yeah, so for banding, if someone else catches the bird, which does happen because there are banding stations everywhere, then that information is all shared. So all banders submit their information to the USGS, and it all goes into the same database. So you can get the information. Most of the time, it's very rare. I mean, you do sometimes capture birds that were banded somewhere else, but more often birds, because they're faithful to migration routes and breeding areas, so more often it's the same station capturing the same bird, like across years or even within the same year. And that is usually where we get more information, yeah. But it doesn't mean that you don't capture other birds, yeah.
When you're handling birds, do you take any special precautions in case, like hand washing or trying to protect the bird from anything that you may be carrying?
That's a good question. Yeah, so it is important to wash your hands when capturing birds. We look out for certain diseases, so a lot of birds will have what's called avian pox, and that one is very visible. They'll like start to, you can see it on like, they start to lose their toes, and you can see different things on them. So whenever we have a bird like that, everything stops. You clean everything that touched the bird, and you're really careful. Also during avian flu outbreaks, we will usually clean everything between every single bird. But then other times a year, we typically don't worry about it as much when there isn't as much disease concern or as much disease transmission. But when there are, like when there was the avian flu outbreak last year, for example, we would clean everything between every bird and that kind of thing. yeah, use just like alcohol and that kind of thing. So, yeah. Oh, this is just more about BioBird. So, yeah, another goal is networking and skill development, and a lot of this. BioBird is a combination of bird-related labs at the University of Wyoming. So we're going to a lot of conferences and that kind of thing. So hopefully, you'll hear more about it soon. And we wanted to mention that UW does have a Giving Day coming up. So if you are interested in supporting BioBird, it is a new organization on campus. So anyway, plug for BioBird. Anyway, I don't know if you want to talk about this is just a quote from one of our interns from the banding station, I think. So
Yeah, there's a lot of benefits to being an intern. I've interned in a couple different labs. It's a wonderful experience. You gain those skills that you throw into a resume and you start sending to your graduate programs or different technician jobs, and it really does benefit undergrads so much to have all of these different opportunities, different times a year to work with their schedules and their availabilities. So BioBird is an amazing initiative to get that started as well.
I think now we'll jump over to PETA stuff, and then if there are more questions at the end, I'll come up again and for both of us.